The first sign something was wrong came at 3:47 a.m. when Aminata Koné's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message that would change everything. She had been investigating corruption in Burkina Faso's mining sector for months, following a trail of suspicious contracts and missing revenue that seemed to lead nowhere. But this message contained coordinates, a time, and a single word that made her blood run cold: proof. Aminata had built her reputation as West Africa's most fearless investigative journalist by exposing stories others wouldn't touch. She had uncovered arms deals, exposed human trafficking networks, and brought down corrupt ministers. But this story felt different. The deeper she dug into Burkina Faso's gold mining operations, the more she realized she wasn't just investigating theft. She was uncovering something far more dangerous. The coordinates led her to an abandoned mining facility 30 kilometers outside Ouagadougou. As her driver navigated the dusty roads in the pre-dawn darkness, Aminata reviewed everything she knew. For the past 8 months, Ibrahim Traoré's government had been negotiating new mining contracts with foreign companies. The official narrative was simple: Burkina Faso was reclaiming control of its natural resources, ensuring that gold revenues would benefit the people rather than disappear into offshore accounts. But Aminata's sources painted a different picture. She had documents showing that several of the new contracts contained unusual clauses. Mining companies were required to make payments not just to the government, but to specific private accounts. When she tried to trace these accounts, she hit walls at every turn. Shell companies registered in Dubai. Banks that claimed no knowledge of the transactions. Officials who suddenly became unreachable. The abandoned mining site looked empty as they approached, but Aminata's contact had been explicit about the timing. She instructed her driver to wait and walked alone toward a cluster of rusted buildings. The silence was broken only by the sound of her footsteps on gravel and the distant call of a night bird. "You came." The voice emerged from the shadows near the largest building. A man stepped forward, his face partially obscured by a cap pulled low over his eyes. Aminata recognized him immediately, though they had never met in person. Colonel Ousmane Diabaté had been feeding her information for weeks through encrypted channels. He was one of the few military officers who had expressed private concerns about certain aspects of Traoré's administration. "You said you had proof," Aminata said, keeping her voice steady despite the tension she felt. Diabaté glanced around nervously before pulling a tablet from his jacket. "What I'm about to show you will put both our lives in danger. Are you prepared for that?" Aminata nodded. She had faced threats before, but something in Diabaté's manner suggested this was different. The colonel activated the tablet and showed her a series of documents. What she saw made her stomach drop. The mining contracts she had been investigating were just the surface layer of something much larger. According to the documents, Ibrahim Traoré had entered into a secret agreement with a consortium of international interests. The deal went far beyond mining rights. This consortium, Diabaté explained, they're not just buying gold. They're buying influence, political control, access to strategic resources across the Sahel region. The documents detailed payments totaling hundreds of millions of dollars, but the money wasn't going into government coffers. Instead, it was being channeled through a network of accounts controlled by individuals close to Traoré's inner circle. Even more troubling were the commitments Traoré had apparently made in exchange for this funding. Look at Section 12, Diabaté said, scrolling to a particular page. Aminata read the text twice before the full implications hit her. The agreement committed Burkina Faso to providing military support for operations in neighboring countries. It granted the consortium exclusive access to uranium deposits that hadn't been publicly acknowledged. Most shocking of all, it included provisions for the establishment of private military facilities that would operate outside the oversight of Burkina Faso's parliament. "Where did you get this?" Aminata asked. "That's not important," Diabaté replied. "What matters is that the people of Burkina Faso have a right to know what deals are being made in their name." But that was only the beginning of what Aminata would uncover. Over the following days, she worked frantically to verify the documents and trace the financial networks they revealed. What she found painted a picture of corruption that reached the highest levels of government, but also exposed her to dangers she hadn't anticipated. Her first breakthrough came when she cross-referenced the consortium members with business registrations across West Africa. The same names appeared in mining deals in Mali, Ghana, and Ivory Coast. They were connected to arms shipments, private security firms, and development projects that seemed designed more to extract resources than to benefit local populations. As she dug deeper, Aminata realized she was investigating not just corruption, but a systematic effort to control resources and political power across the region. The Traoré deal was part of a larger strategy that involved multiple governments and stretched from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the Sahara. But her investigation was not going unnoticed. 3 days after her meeting with Diabaté, Aminata's office was broken into. Nothing appeared to be stolen, but her computer files had been accessed. Her secure communication channels started experiencing unusual disruptions. When she tried to contact Diabaté, his phone went straight to voicemail. The pressure intensified when she received a visit from 2 men claiming to be from the Ministry of Information. They were polite but firm in their message. Certain stories were not in the national interest. They suggested she focus her reporting on more positive developments in Burkina Faso's economic growth. Aminata had faced government pressure before, but this felt different. These men knew details about her personal life, her family, her movements around the city. They weren't just trying to discourage her reporting, they were sending a message about how closely she was being watched. No one expected what came next. 2 days later, Colonel Diabaté was found dead in his apartment. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, but Aminata knew better. The colonel had been in excellent health, and he had mentioned receiving threats related to his decision to share information with her. The death of her source forced Aminata to make a difficult decision. She could abandon the story and protect herself, or she could push forward knowing that powerful interests were willing to kill to keep their secrets hidden. She chose to continue, but she also knew she needed to be smarter about how she proceeded. Working from a series of safe locations around Ouagadougou, Aminata began reaching out to other potential sources. She contacted mining workers, government employees, and military personnel who might have knowledge of the consortium's activities. Most were too frightened to speak, but a few were willing to share information anonymously. What emerged was a picture of an operation that had been planned for years. The consortium hadn't simply approached Traoré with a business proposal, they had been cultivating relationships with key figures in his administration long before he came to power. They had provided funding for military equipment, training programs, and development projects that created networks of obligation and dependence. The most disturbing revelation came from a former ministry official who agreed to meet Aminata in a crowded market where their conversation would be difficult to monitor. According to this source, the consortium's ultimate goal wasn't just to control Burkina Faso's resources, but to use the country as a base for expanding their influence throughout the Sahel. They want to create a new kind of colonialism, the official explained. Not direct political control, but economic and military dominance that gives them everything they need while allowing local leaders to maintain the appearance of independence. The source provided Aminata with additional documents that showed how the consortium was using similar strategies in other countries. They were funding rebel groups in some areas while supporting government forces in others, creating instability that justified increased security spending and foreign intervention. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. According to the documents, Ibrahim Traoré himself might not have been fully aware of the consortium's broader agenda when he first agreed to work with them. The deal had been presented to him as a way to secure funding for development projects and military modernization. Only later, as the relationship deepened, did the full scope of the consortium's expectations become clear. He's trapped now, the source explained. They have too much leverage over him. Even if he wanted to back out, they have enough information to destroy him politically or worse. This revelation changed everything for Aminata. Instead of simply exposing corruption, she was uncovering a story about how foreign interests were systematically undermining African sovereignty. The consortium wasn't just stealing resources, they were capturing entire governments and using them to advance a broader agenda of control and exploitation. As she prepared to publish her investigation, Aminata faced a new set of challenges. Her usual publication, a respected Pan-African magazine, suddenly became reluctant to run the story. The editor cited concerns about verification and potential legal challenges, but Aminata suspected pressure was being applied from other sources. She reached out to international publications, but many were hesitant to run a story that relied heavily on anonymous sources and leaked documents. The few that showed interest wanted additional confirmation that Aminata struggled to provide without putting more lives at risk. The breakthrough came when she received an unexpected call from a journalist in Paris who had been investigating similar patterns of resource extraction and political manipulation across Francophone Africa. They agreed to collaborate, sharing information and sources in a way that strengthened both their investigations. Working together, they were able to establish connections between the Burkina Faso consortium and similar groups operating in other countries. They found evidence of coordinated strategies, shared funding sources, and overlapping personnel that suggested a much larger organization with significant resources and reach. But as their investigation gained momentum, so did the efforts to stop them. Aminata's Paris collaborator reported being followed and having his communications monitored. When they tried to arrange a face-to-face meeting, both journalists received warnings that convinced them it was too dangerous. The pressure reached a breaking point when Aminata's family began receiving threats. Her elderly mother was approached by strangers who asked detailed questions about Aminata's work and schedule. Her brother's business suddenly faced regulatory problems that threatened to shut him down. The message was clear: stop the investigation or face consequences that extended far beyond herself. For the first time since beginning the story, Aminata seriously considered giving up. She had built her career on the principle that truth and transparency were essential for democracy and development. But she had never faced a situation where pursuing the truth put her entire family at risk. The decision came down to a simple question: what would happen if she stopped? The consortium would continue their operations, extracting wealth and undermining sovereignty across the region. Other journalists might take up the story eventually, but by then, how much damage would have been done? She decided to push forward, but with a new strategy. Instead of trying to publish one comprehensive exposé, she would release the information gradually through multiple channels. She would work with international organizations, civil society groups, and other journalists to ensure that the story couldn't be suppressed by threatening or eliminating any single person. The first article appeared simultaneously in publications across 3 continents. It focused specifically on the mining contracts and the unusual financial arrangements they contained. The response was immediate and intense. Government officials in Ouagadougou denied any wrongdoing and suggested that the documents were fabricated by foreign interests seeking to destabilize Burkina Faso. But the denials rang hollow when Aminata released additional evidence, including bank records and communications that corroborated the leaked documents. Within days, other journalists in the region began investigating similar patterns in their own countries, creating a wave of scrutiny that the consortium couldn't easily contain. The real turning point came when a group of military officers in Burkina Faso issued a public statement calling for transparency about the government's international agreements. They didn't explicitly support Aminata's reporting, but their call for accountability created political space for other voices to speak out. Opposition politicians began demanding parliamentary investigations. Civil society organizations called for public disclosure of all mining and security agreements. International observers expressed concerns about the lack of transparency in Burkina Faso's resource management. Ibrahim Traoré found himself in an impossible position. Acknowledging the agreements would confirm that he had made commitments without proper oversight or public consultation. Denying them became increasingly difficult as more evidence emerged. His administration's credibility was being systematically undermined by the very relationships that were supposed to strengthen his position. But the consortium wasn't finished. As public pressure mounted, they began implementing a more aggressive strategy to protect their interests. Key witnesses who had spoken to journalists began disappearing or recanting their statements. Government officials who had called for investigations suddenly changed their positions or were transferred to remote posts. Most troubling of all, Aminata began receiving information that suggested the consortium was planning to escalate their response. According to sources within the security services, there were discussions about declaring a state of emergency that would justify restrictions on press freedom and political opposition. The final phase of the story unfolded rapidly. Aminata published a series of articles revealing the consortium's broader strategy across the Sahel region, including their connections to political destabilization and resource extraction in multiple countries. The evidence was overwhelming, but it also exposed her as the primary threat to their operations. On a Tuesday morning in November, Aminata's apartment was raided by security forces claiming to investigate threats to national security. She wasn't present during the raid, having spent the night at a safe location, but the message was clear: her time in Burkina Faso was running out. With the help of international colleagues and human rights organizations, Aminata managed to leave the country before she could be arrested. From exile, she watched as the story she had uncovered continued to unfold. Parliamentary investigations were launched in multiple countries. International organizations began examining resource extraction agreements more carefully. The consortium's operations faced scrutiny they had never experienced before. Ibrahim Traoré's position became increasingly precarious as public pressure mounted. He attempted to distance himself from the most controversial aspects of the agreements, claiming that he had been misled about their implications. But the damage to his credibility was severe, and the political costs of the consortium relationship began to outweigh its benefits. The story that began with a simple investigation into mining corruption had evolved into something much larger. An exposé of systematic efforts to undermine African sovereignty through economic and political manipulation. It revealed how foreign interests were using local leaders to advance agendas that served external rather than national priorities. But the victory came at enormous personal cost. Aminata's career in Burkina Faso was over. Her family faced ongoing threats, and several sources who had helped her paid with their lives or freedom. The truth had been revealed, but the price of that revelation was higher than anyone had anticipated. From her new base in Europe, Aminata continued reporting on African affairs, but she never forgot the lessons of the Traoré investigation. The story had shown her that corruption wasn't just about individuals enriching themselves at public expense. It was about entire systems being captured by interests that had no loyalty to the people whose resources they were exploiting. The consortium's operations in Burkina Faso were eventually curtailed, but not eliminated. New agreements were negotiated with greater transparency and oversight, but the fundamental dynamics of resource extraction and external influence remained largely unchanged. The exposure of their methods had forced them to be more careful, but it hadn't fundamentally altered their objectives. Years later, as Aminata reflected on the story that had changed her life, she realized that her greatest achievement hadn't been exposing the specific details of Traoré's deal with the consortium. It had been demonstrating that these arrangements could be investigated, challenged, and disrupted by determined journalism and public accountability. The story had shown that even the most sophisticated efforts to capture governments and extract resources could be exposed when journalists were willing to take risks and citizens were prepared to demand transparency. It had proven that truth, however dangerous to uncover, remained a powerful weapon against exploitation and manipulation. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to FictionWire Africa. This is a fictional story created purely for entertainment.